Hello, welcome. My name is Elise McQueen. I am the chair for this year's Annual Artist Interviews. This is organized by the Services to Artists Committee. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the ancestral Lenape homelands and where we currently stand. We recognize the long-standing significance of these lands for Lenape nations past and present. Historical awareness of Indigenous exclusion and erasure is critically important, and we will continue to work to overcome the injustices committed against Indigenous populations. This year's Artist Interview series features the work of Elia Alba and the art collective Postcommodity. First, we are going to have our interview of Elia. Elia was born in Brooklyn to parents who immigrated from the Dominican Republic in the 1950s. She is a multidisciplinary artist whose artistic practice is concerned with the social and political complexity of race, identity, and the collective community. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree from Hunter College in 1994 and completed the Whitney Independent Study Program in 2001. She has exhibited throughout the United States and abroad, including at the Studio Museum in Harlem, El Museo del Barrio, Science Museum London, Smithsonian Museum of Art, National Museum of Art, the Reina Sofia, Madrid. Awards include Studio Museum of Harlem Artists in Residence Program in 1999, the Paula Krasner Foundation Grant in 2002, Joan Mitchell Foundation Grant in 2002, and in 2008. Anonymous was a Woman Award in 2019 and Latinx Artist Fellowship in 2021. Her work is in the collections of the Smithsonian Museum of Art, El Museo del Barrio, and Lowe Art Museum. Her book, Elia Alba, The Supper Club, brings together artists, scholars, and performers of diasporic cultures through photography, food, and dialogue to examine race and culture in the United States. She was part of the curatorial team for El Museo del Barrio critically acclaimed exhibition, Estamos Bien, La Triennale 2021. She lives and works in the Bronx. Elia will be interviewed by Susanna Temkin. Susanna is a curator at El Museo del Barrio, where she has curated the currently on view exhibition, Domestic Connex, I got it, and helped organize Juan Francisco Elso Borimerica. Temkin earned her master's and PhD degrees from the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University, where her research focused on modern art in the Americas with a focus on Cuba. Prior to El Museo, she served as assistant curator at America Society in New York, as well as a research and archives specialist at the Cecilia de Torres Ltd., where she assisted in co-authoring the digital catalog Raison of artist Joaquin Torres. Temkin has published essays and reviews in exhibition catalogs and magazines, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Alice Neal, People Come First, the Rutgers Art Review, Burlington Magazine, and among others. Welcome.
Thank you all, for being tonight, Friday evening. I was honored to be invited by Elia Alba. So thrilled to be talking about your art, Elia, but I just have to acknowledge our collaboration, our friendship, so I know we'll have a fun conversation, and really thrilled to be sharing the stage with Postcommodity following us. So I thought, Elia, since it was mentioned already in your bio, how your work is at El Museo del Barrio, where I'm a curator, so I thought maybe we could just start with the work that's in our collection that was actually acquired by, I think, Deborah Cullen, who's here in the audience with us. And I think maybe this is a good introduction to your practice, and then we'll go back and forward in what you've been working on before and since.
These suits I did in 2003. As in my bio mentioned, my parents come from the Dominican Republic. But I've always found myself in between spaces and identities. You're either to this or to that. And I think in thinking about that, I really wanted to kind of manifest that in this work. Initially, I was doing a video. So there is a video for this, but I wanted to think about what it would be to be all like these different kind of races. But also, I think just around that time, I had started knowing about like Costa paintings and these ideas of all these kinds of mixing of races. So all that stuff kind of informed this particular body of work. And so here, you know, you see myself as...
There are 3 suits.
There are 3 different bodysuits, and you see myself here as like a quote-unquote white person, a quote-unquote black person, and then a mixed race person, which is what I consider myself to be. But, you know, again, the idea of race is not seamless, so it's kind of alludes to it being like a construction, but also something that there's some elements of fantasy in these bodysuits as well.
Yeah, I mean, and that's in the title, right?
Yeah. If I were a, what is that? And then the bodysuits themselves were not meant to be worn by me. These are actually images of my body, but exaggerated and manipulated on the computer. So they were done for a man to wear. So in the video, which I do not have here, a man is trying on these female bodysuits and kind of feeling a little bit uncomfortable in all of them. Not sure if he looks right or not sure if what he has on is correct. So it's not only just playing with race, but kind of these ideas about gender and who is what, and you know, because I've always kind of found that discussions on gender kind of mirror my own preoccupation about living in this kind of like third space all the time, where you're not either one thing or the other. So I felt like the bodysuits was a way for me to kind of express that.
I'm gonna just move us to the next, and we can always come back and forth. Is this an image of the performance?
So this is, yeah, so this is an image, and one thing I should add, around that time in 2003, I worked a lot with 2 performance artists. One was Nicolás Tomita-Esteves, and the other one was Clifford Owens. And in this one, this is Nicolás wearing the suit. It was just like a production still that I took, but I think you can get a better sense of how the suit was made. And I should mention that because a lot of my sculptural work is done through a photo transfer process. It's something that I kind of accidentally it happened. I was very much interested in, I've always been a photographer, but by accident, I was playing with materials and I left like a newspaper on top of a medium, and I realized that the inks kind of absorbed it, and I thought, well, you know, wow, like why can't I consider now building on a photograph, making that photograph almost like 3-dimensional. And so this is kind of where these ideas, these photo transfers. So a lot of the sculptures that you're going to see here, they're all photo transfers on fabric.
I think I told Elia, you know, I obviously we began this presentation with the work from El Museo, but really the first time that I came to know of your practice was in an exhibition at the 8th floor that Sarah Raceman, I think, put together.
Yes, she did.
And I became totally entranced with the activation of the bodysuit, because there was a video of Nicolás performing in it, and then this piece, Portrait of a Young Girl. So again, I'm always really interested in titles, so I'm curious a little bit about the title, but I think it's really interesting what you said about wanting to move into a 3rd dimension when we look at this piece, because she's completely crinkled, smushed against the wall in this case. This is you again. Is this like an autobiographical piece? I mean, I think autobiography is through all your work, but can you?
It is, even when I'm not utilizing myself. But yes, this is again a bodysuit that I started to do, not necessarily knowing exactly where I was going to go with it. And again, I just kind of, sometimes I work very intuitively and not necessarily plot it all out. I think for me, it's especially with the nape, because I'm working with materials and fabrics, sometimes I feel it's important to kind of let that fabric or let that work kind of come out towards me. So in this case, just to go back to the title, Portrait of a Young Girl is a reference to Picasso's Portrait of a Young Girl, which was done during his Cubist phase. And I wanted to I was thinking about that, you know, this idea when the whole idea of Cubism being like a breaking down of the picture plane. So here is this transfer, but I'm breaking it down more as a sculpture. And so everything is kind of inverted. So her hands are posed, so is she praying? What is she doing? But her backside is exposed to you as her feet. So there's some like a little bit of sexual tension in there. And there's a little bit of element of grotesque in it too, because you're not really quite sure what's going on with the work.
I wanted to actually, you talked about playing with the fabric, and like I've been in your studio where I see you pinning the fabric on the walls. Is that how this evolved? Were you just like manipulating, and how did you end up at this kind of, was it thinking about Cubism that you ended up with this kind
Yes, because I had made the suits, still wanting to and another point I should make, sometimes I'll start, this bodysuits, the first bodysuits I did in 2003, and I will come back to an idea again. I don't necessarily say, okay, I did it in 2003, I can't retake it again 10 or 12 years later. So this was a bodysuit that I had already pre-made. And then I started to, I just had it on a table and I just started playing with it. You know, I was envisioning of cutting off the feet and kind of sewing that back on. But instead, it was easier for me to kind of like shrink it and put it all together. It's probably like about, I don't know, like 36 inches. So it's kind of imagining my body collapsing. And yeah, so I was kind of thinking about when, you know, like Cubist art and this kind of collapsing of the picture plane in thinking about that. And then I put on synthetic hair, so to make it even a little weirder. I like weird things.
Well, I mean, I think we should remember that when we get towards the end of your of this presentation, and we see some of the current work you're working on. It's really nice, I think, for me to see how you're shifting some of these ideas in terms of proportion, size, beings. This is a work that I wasn't so familiar with, and I know you really wanted to show. And I want to ask you about the contrast between the singular girl that we just saw, who kind of contains multitudes. Like you've already mentioned how, you know, you are interested in multiplicities of identity, but here, I mean, this is literal multitudes, a crowd, a gathering.
Yeah, it is kind of like a crowd. So this is a project that I did in 1999 when I was a resident at the Studio Museum in Harlem. I had just recently given birth when I was accepted into the program. And, you know, my mother had worked in the garment industry up until she retired. So this is kind of like my first segue into working with fabrics. And that's why I think it was important to put it in. So at that time, I was thinking a lot about the labor that we put in as mother, as wives, because I was a wife at that time as well, versus, you know, what was happening at the same time, which was this big conversation on sweatshops. It really came out within media in 1998, 1999. So for me, there was kind of like this juxtaposition, or this kind of, I felt like something to be said about, you know, laborers that are like unappreciated, and woman's work that is unappreciated, and how do these two things come together? So as you can see in the little corner picture, they're actually like baby booties. So they allude to like a mother maybe knitting some booties, but they also can look like little fantasy and fairy slippers, which kind of alludes to the fantasy, which is the fashion industry. So it's kind of merging all these like different ideas to get to this work, but they're not really, you know, the shoe in art is kind of, you know, it's kind of like a stand-in. And so these are a stand-in not for the wearers or the babies because they're small. These little shoes went from 1 to maybe 4 or 5 inches, but actually for the laborers and mothers who created them.
And why red?
Red has a lot to do with the body and blood, and so there, you know, some of the booties, some people, they do look, some of them look a little phallic, some of them look like female body parts. So it was, again, combining all that stuff together.
Yeah.
Which I never really talk about it, but if people pick up on it, then I'll say, yeah, that's it.
I just want to keep us moving. And again, I mean, this is another work dealing with multitudes that, I mean, a very time-sensitive piece. We can look at the date, and I think I should let you elaborate on, this was recently discussed since it was the 20th anniversary of September 11th.
Of September 11th. So I don't consider this piece kind of a homage. More thinking about, at the time I was reading, I probably shouldn't even be saying this, but I was reading Capitalism and Schizophrenia, A Thousand Plateaus. And that's kind of where the idea, I was starting to reread it. Mm-hmm. And there, you know, in there, they were talking about this idea of power, and sometimes how these things or these conversations on unity is really only in the service of power. It's a way to divide people. But then you have this tower which contains all the faces of all the people that perished. I think if you, the next one, of all the people that perished. It's like about 3,000 little faces. I think it was about 3,000, more or less. And I created little pillow faces, again with the photo transfer process. I made little pillows and stuck them in the tower. You know, I think, you know, when we think about it, death is kind of like the master equalizer. You know, there is no discussion on unity anymore. Everyone's kind of all in the same place. And when I was envisioning this, I was envisioning making really large heads. I didn't put this in this slideshow, but before I started doing this, I had done some larger heads as sculptures and put them in photographs. But with this, I realized that it was important to think about this idea of collapsing, you know, and as sad as it was, I kind of imagined there being a collapse of bodies just piling up on top of one another.
But I think, I mean, there's something about care, right? You, in the previous, the red shoes, you talked about women's labor and you know, the act of making that goes unrecognized. And to me, like, there's, I mean, very intimate work when you're working with these small pillows that are someone's face, and the physical labor that it took you. I mean, I imagine it must have been meditative, or...
It was, and it wasn't, because I remember my son was maybe 4, and he was just so tired of seeing all those like, I couldn't go to my studio, so I had to work, I was working from home to do this, and he was just, get them out of here, you know. I mean, and he would throw himself on that, and so yes, it was, but it was also too, like, every time you saw a face, you know, it's like when you see a face that you know is not around, you have to wonder about their life, and you know, so there is some form of care in there, mm-hmm. you know, and trying to preserve a history, and also this idea of unity. You know, we were united by a very white American front. That's what kind of was the response. Meanwhile, those towers were not just filled; they were filled with many people also from Latin America and the Caribbean, which was it got kind of lost in the conversation, and also other Muslim people that were in there as well, not just the attackers. So I was very much interested in how that was playing out.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we should move to the next slide, but you know, this is an instance of you recognizing a community.
Yes.
I mean, a community united by all working and being in the same place, but that kind of recognition of community is, I think, really critical to what we'll continue to see in your work.
And you see it in the shoes too. You know, mm-hmm. It's a community of laborers and mothers. And this was actually just a production still to a video that I did called La Haba, which is in the Dominican Republic a term that means high yellow. It's not complimentary, and I was told that many times growing up. So it always kind of made me feel awkward, and so in this video you have this, again, Nicolás Esteves, this was done in 2003, where I, again, created a community skirt, you know, and it was kind of a nod to Josephine Baker. If I think all of you know Josephine Baker, a Black American dancer, went to Paris. She was all the rage, but she danced with bananas around her hips, and the implications of that were, you know, I think we all know what they were. So here I make literal those bananas into people of color. And so in this picture, again, this is Nicholas wearing my face, dancing around with this skirt, and he's twirling around, and it has like some kind of 60s cha-cha music, boogaloo music. I think it's funny. Probably should have bought the video instead.
I mean, I think I want to ask you a little bit about like who are the people we see on the skirt. I don't think we need to know that, but I'm curious again about you like bringing community together, and who, for this particular work, who's there?
For any friend that allows me to make them into a doll head or a mask, you know, I relied a lot on my friends to let me photograph them. I couldn't randomly say, look, to a stranger, I'm doing this, can I photograph you like this? And then they're like, what? You know, although I have gotten that reaction.
I mean, I'm sure now everyone probably wants to be photographed by you. And can you just tell us too, I mean, this is in a way, I think, more of a composed piece than we'll see in the next few images that also use this idea of the mask. So can you tell me like a little bit more about like working on the studio set versus working on, you know, some of the masks that we'll see that are...
Yeah, so with this idea, I think that was well, was it this one or the one when I did If I Were in 2003? I was making these big heads, and I introduced the mask because I wanted to just cover the person, you know, cover the person up. But I really started to think about how the mask, especially like for myself, where, you know, when I was traveling back and forth between the DR and here, there was always some kind of, again, this in-between space I was always living in, this kind of code switching and camouflage, and just trying to be whatever it is that you wanted me to be in that particular moment. So the mask, which I was preoccupied with photographing people with masks. I did them, I think you can go to the next slide. I did them, yeah. I did them, you know, through the city. You know, I traveled with my family to Mexico. Everybody wanted to go on a tour bus. I hated it, but I did it anyway. And so I made them wear my mask. That's my son with the water bottle at a very young age. I cannot ask him now to do anything. But back then, it was easy. Do it. That's what your mom says.
But I love to, I mean, you kind of, in a veiled way, already brought up your mom and how she was part of the garment industry. And I know your mom has helped you create some of your work. So, I mean, your family has always been around and kind of been complicit in your art making?
Yeah, my mom, I love my mom, but my mom, I don't know, for those that have a Latina mom, they can be really intense. And my mom was certainly that. And we had our differences, but once I decided, and by the way, I wasn't 18 and said I'm going to be an artist. I was photographing a lot in my late 20s, but it's really when I turned like 30 that I said, okay, I'm going to be an artist now, you know. And they're like, what are you doing? And so I started to, it was just because when I started to work with fabrics, you know, I was starting to ask my mom, how can I do this? How can I sew this? How can I put this together? And, you know, within that, she goes, well, you can do this or that. And that's how we started to collaborate. So she would help me make the masks. I would do the transfers. The bodysuits, she sewed it completely. You know, I did all the transfers on the body, but she was the one. Those booties that you saw, the way they were done was like I would make a little bag out of fabric and then mold it with my hands and then let it dry. You know, I would put a solution or something to make it dry. But she sewed all those bags.
Yeah, yeah.
You know.
I'm always interested in, you know, these, they're not necessarily family lineages. I know she wasn't an artist, but, you know, how you kind of have observed her and knew what her skills were. And she, I mean, she's a collaborator, basically.
She is, and my mom, when I was, you know, we were the best dressed kids on the block because my mom always sewed, you know. She was always sewing our clothes, coats, you know, she even learned how to make hats, you know, just because that was her way. But I also think, too, a lot about how that is just kind of like I believe, a form of agency for many folks, immigrants that come here, and it's like a way, it's a thing that they control, it's a thing that they make.
I mean, it's interesting. You actually like strip your people down when you create your bodysuits, you know.
Oh, well, not really.
I want to ask you too, though. I mean, I know this is a film still, but you kind of buried the fact that you started in photography.
I always do that.
Yeah, like, I mean, tell us about, like, what's the start of you picking up the camera?
So the start of me was, in the 80s, I was a party girl. I wasn't thinking about making art. I liked to go out. And
you were being photographed.
I guess. I don't want to talk about that. I dabbled in a little bit of modeling, just a little bit. And I was always going out, and I would have like my little Canon AE, was like a film camera, and I would photograph a lot of people. Unfortunately, a lot of those photographs are gone because I had people like Basquiat, I had people like Keith Haring, because we were all around the same generation, and you know, I was just photographing these people because they looked like they were fun, you know. And lots of other characters of 80s nightlife. But then there was this woman at the time called Martha Swoop, and she was the premier photographer. It's like the one that everyone went to photograph all the theater and all opera performances, etc. And I'm like, I want that job. So I decided to reach out to smaller companies and started photographing those sets, which I think really helped me when I was into, you know, fast forward into 2015 with the Supper Club. But it wasn't satisfying enough to just be documenting these things, even though I had a lot of fun with it. And it's great when you're with actors because they're so dramatic and they'll just give you what you want. So then that's when I kind of stopped after that. I stopped for a while and started going into more sculptural practices, and then merging photography with this, through photo transfers into sculpture, and then, you know, coming back to photography and doing masks of people, you know.
Yeah, I mean,
constant layers of stuff.
Yeah, I kind of fast forward over some of the slides, and we can certainly go back, but I wanted, since you're talking about being a club kid and how that influenced your practice, I wanted us to maybe talk about Larry Levain.
Yeah, Levain.
Levain. Cookies.
Levain. He was vain.
So yeah, tell us, I mean, who is Larry for those who don't know, and why did you want to, you know, recast him?
So Larry Levain was a DJ who started off in the 70s in the Continental bathhouses, not that I went there, but I couldn't go there even if I wanted to. It was predominantly a bathhouse in the 70s, and I think I was a little too young. But he then this person named Mel Charon. This was, of course, around the time of late disco, and he owned West End Records, and he actually started this club called Paradise Garage, where Larry Levain was the head DJ. I think he was just the resident DJ there. And he was there from like the late 70s to like the late 80s, and I went during the 80s. And, it started off as a gay club, but then they kind of started to let women in. Of course, this was a time where you didn't need ID and you could be...
But it was a special space.
It was a
special
very,
ambiance.
It was a very special ambiance. Larry Levan was, I think, the first DJ to really look at DJ as not a thing about placing records, but thinking about moods and how people feel, and grabbing onto what he was seeing in the audience of the people that was there. I mean, every time I went to Paradise Garage, no one was sitting, everyone was dancing. He was almost like a shaman. And he also, he made machines that is kind of what we see now in current DJs. He introduced the dub aesthetic. I think he's if you speak to any DJ, they're going to know exactly who this person is, because he's like the godfather, maybe the grandfather of all this, of grandfather of DJs. So for me, it was, the way this project happened was my friend and curator, Edwin Ramoran, we were talking about disco and the importance of disco, which unfortunately disco has become this, or became this kind of like plastic parody, and
Studio 54, right?
It got incredibly whitewashed when it was actually something that started in black and brown environments. Not to say that there weren't white DJs, but that's really where it started. And so in that conversation, that's where in discussing Larry Levan and that time period, I wanted to do a series of photographs where, dancer and the DJ are one. So people are dancing to the remixes, and I photographed them. I mean, I had to, it was a fun night. We got everyone a little tipsy, and I snapped away.
I didn't even realize it was a singular night. I always thought of this as...
It was actually 2 nights in a club that doesn't exist, but was 2 doors down from where I live now.
Full circle.
Full circle. Want to go back to the...
Sure. Here?
Yeah, go back one more. These are, again, with the masks, these are, again, like photo transfers. I believe it was in 2009. Yeah, the Larry Levan was in 06. Talking about full circle and coming back to works that I've done in the past. This is kind of like, this is something I was always envisioning right after I did the.
We're good.
We're good? Okay. Right after I did the suits. But I didn't get to do it until like about 6 years later. And this was shown at the Havana Biennale. You could go to the next one. And so here, these are masks that are like kind of masked torsos. They're actually the same size as the people that you see here. And so they can be, but another person can wear it too.
I mean, have they ever been worn? I mean, maybe that's a way we should get into like the performative aspect of your work. I mean, we talked about it with the videos and Nicolas, but like...
No, these have not been worn. They were done, and they were done to kind of to be like kind of like, not African masks, but kind of lucha libre. Mm-hmm. I don't know how to say that in...
Wrestler.
Wrestler, yeah.
Wrestler. I mean,
but wrestler and lucha libre are 2 different things.
Yeah. But let's talk about, I mean, I'm curious. When we were chatting, we were going to talk about portraiture, which I know we'll get to with the Subret Club. But, I mean, costuming versus masks versus bodysuits. Do you want to talk about those nuances that you see in these practices?
Well, there are things that are kind of, that you think they can be performed, but not necessarily performed. So you do have a sense that there's some performance element in the work. With the suits, that was definitely the intention with them. With these masks, no. I mean, the way these masks came about was, the Metropolitan Museum has a Greek wing of busts, classical busts. which I find again fascinating when I think about, okay, these people are not around, what would their lives were. But what's interesting, like when you turn the corner, there's like the African wing. I've always found it very interesting, this juxtaposition of this classical like sculpture with this African way of representation. So I wanted to kind of look at that and think about doing that in both ways. And when you think of like non-Western sculptures, especially those in particular, what you'll find is the shape remains the same. What changes is the inscription or the insignia. Maybe, you know, there's one perfect example of that from the Dogon tribe. It's two figures that look exactly the same, but when you go to the back, you'll see one is carrying that looks like a little spear, the other one is a little head in a sack, which implies a child. And so I thought, when I was doing this, thinking about merging these two ideas into one. And again, it's kind of going back to that doll, that what I consider the doll portrait of a young girl, this kind of collapsing of a photograph, and making it into a 3D and then kind of reconstructing it all over again.
Well then, I mean, maybe we should talk about also sources, because so far you've mentioned, I mean, the Met, Cubism, Greek art, African art. We've talked about disco.
It's a long,
club culture. And so, I mean, some of this, I think, eventually comes together in the Supper Club, and the portraits that are the result of the Supper Club. But I feel like I'm getting ahead of myself, because the Supper Club is really about a conversation and about a community, and the portraits are.
I mean, I think the ideas or the conversations live on in these archetypes I create through the portraits. So the Supper Club was a project I started in 2012, and it was initially just going to be, I was going to create the zine, because around that time I felt there wasn't enough representation of Black and Latinos in just like regular media, of, you know, Vogue, Vanity Fair. I'll admit I like those magazines. But so I said I'm going to make my own zine. But in the process of doing that and photographing folks, I realized that I wanted to contextualize them with their, like with their thoughts and their ideas. And so I created 3 dinners. That was what it was going to be. I was going to do 3 dinners where everyone was in conversation. So the zine was going to have all these fabulous pictures and these 3 conversations, kind of like when you open up a Vanity Fair where they have artists like witty bantering. Well, there was no witty banter in these first 3 dinners. It was actually really intense, and the ideas of race and, you know, who gets to, you know, the idea that some people feel like some people, folks like myself, can take it on and off, where some people can't. It became about agency. It was hosted then by a friend and performance artist, Wanda Raimundo Ortiz. I don't know if she's in the audience right now. Where is she? Where's she at? Hey, there you go. And if you know her work and you know her character Chuleta, she's some bossy blank from the Bronx who likes to talk to you about art. So I felt I couldn't pose the questions to the folks at these dinners.
Can we give an example of like what one of the themes for the dinners were? Because they're...
Well, these first 3 dinners were on identity and agency. Agency within the art world, and identity. How do you identify? And what do you do to accommodate? You know, because there's always this discussion amongst artists that we have to kind of, even with some curators, to how much do we compromise of our own integrity to get where we want to go, right? So that too was part of the conversation.
So I mean, at what point, like you said, this was going to be a zine, 3 dinners.
Well, these dinners with Wanda changed the game for me when it came to dinners. I felt, you know what, it's not going to be enough to really unpack the things that were being said in 3 dinners, because that's how it evolved into being this thing about conversations, where then, you know, after 2014, we switched from it being about agency and identity and started to deal with real political issues, and partly because, you know, BLM was starting, Mike Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, all this stuff was happening. We had a black president, and there was just a lot of things that were not connecting, and I think folks really wanted to have these discussions, wanted to have a safe space, because that's what the Supper Club became then, this kind of safe space for people to just say what they're going to say without being chastised or finger pointed or whatever. So I did 3 dinners with Recess Art, and then I did some dinners on my own, and then the Rubin Foundation, or the 8th floor, Sarah Reisman was working there, and she really liked the project and said, you want to continue it here. So I became kind of like a resident with them for about 3 years. And in total, I hosted about 40 dinners.
And I want to just, for those of you, I mean, the book is wonderful, but it contains some of the portraits that we'll get to right now, but it also contains transcripts from the dinners themselves. So it's like this pastiche of the voices, and then, as you said, you created these avatars of sorts for...
Avatars, archetypes, you know, I don't know, like someone said they're icons. I don't know, like icon. Maybe they could be icons, you know, however you want to see it. But they represent, the idea behind the photographs was to capture the artist in a way that's reflective of their practice, at least the way I saw it, you know. And the photographs were definitely a collaboration. Nobody was forced to do something they didn't want to do. So I would have discussions. I had many discussions, and some people were keen on what I wanted to do, and some people were not, and we would revisit until we got to the place where people felt comfortable with what I was going to do. So, you know, these images are kind of like a combination of a person's, you know, persona and their art practice. And so they're kind of, yeah, I guess they are kind of like avatars or archetypes for their practice, or what their practice is putting out into the world.
Mm-hmm. And oh, go ahead.
No, and they all have like monikers. This one is the Orisha, Juana Valdez. I know I saw her walk in here. This is Sean Leonardo, the hero. That was photographed at the Brooklyn Museum.
And I mean, this gets back to, as you're saying, like some of your photographic origins, right? Now you're creating the sets. You're creating the tableaus. Yeah.
This is Lorraine.
And let's talk about, I mean, Lorraine, let's talk about the kind of this community, your community, but there's a wide range of generations that we're seeing, people from different, you know, parts of the art world, performance artists, painters. I mean, this Supper Club is really bringing together a relatively diverse group. I'm curious about how your selection process went, you know?
Well, I went to my friends or people that I knew first, and because I wanted to make sure they were comfortable with me. I didn't really ask artists that I didn't know that well. I mean, that was it. You know, not everyone.
But I think only you, I mean, very few people would be able to convene this group. I think, you know, getting to know you, you're like a convener of community, of like a very special, very intersectional, you overlap, you talk about overlaps between communities, you make people talk to each other sometimes that don't want to.
Well, never underestimate the power of food and wine, you know?
I think it goes beyond that.
No, but see, I think it does. I mean, I think about my mom, you know, my mom and dad came here. They didn't go to restaurants, you know, but there was always a party. Oh, she lost a tooth, a party. Oh, you know, a confirmation or whatever, a party. Oh, it's your dad's, you know, there was always a gathering in my house. And I remember the conversations were always around these kinds of things, you know.
Well, and we're being told that we need to wrap up so that all of you can start to ask Elia questions. But I just want to acknowledge, I mean, that ability to talk to like cross generations, to also, I think, serve as a mentor or like a generator of lineages. I just want to acknowledge how essential you were as the co-curator of Estamos Bien. But I'm going to quickly go back to one of your hands.
Just one of the hands even there.
And then I want to get to the dolls, but I want to just talk
We'll
about
flash
again.
the dolls, but we'll talk the hands because this is in keeping with right now what I'm doing. This is my current, what I'm working on now, is creating like portraits of people, but through their hands. And Mira might recognize these hands. This is a mutual friend, Ivan Monforte. Creating this portrait, and my idea is to make going back to that Greek hall of bust, like a big room full of hands where these like people's particular histories, especially people of color, are manifesting through their hands.
Mm-hmm. I know you want to end on the hands, but I want to end on the dolls.
She wants to end on the dolls.
Because I just really, I think they really bring together so much of what we've seen, but like, I mean, who are the dolls? You, Elia?
The dolls are all me. I do play with dolls. I even collect brat dolls. With the dolls, I've been making dolls since.
And
like
maybe dolls is not the right word.
No, dolls is the right word. I've been making them since 2010. I know people that do dolls don't like them to be called dolls, but they actually are. They're like 24 inches. They're not big. The dolls really, again, I read a lot, and there's always like particular histories. I'm reading a lot now about like pre-colonial histories and imagining what those people would look like. So here are like the DDs, they have like this big red hair. I remember seeing a photograph from Albert Watson of these Nigerian women with these big, their hair really teased out, and they weren't flapping or falling like this. So the dolls, if we think about dolls as kind of a manifestation of, not the community, but like society at large, I think, and dolls can be very educational and not always in a good way. So for me, it's like kind of bringing the idea of these like multitude of stories, like where they kind of look like they belong all together, but where are they from? What are you trying to tell me? Like the NoMo here is...
There's fantasy elements.
There's a lot of fantasy elements about the NoMo were a group of aliens that came down and into Earth and gave the Dogon people the knowledge of astronomy. And the way I came to that was through a found footage on YouTube of these two anthropologists that were very, they couldn't understand how this tribe knew about the galaxies, stars, and the universe without having a telescope. So I'm interested with the dolls and bringing all these like kind of unresolved or hidden histories.
Mythologies.
And mythologies.
Yeah.
The end.
Excellent. I know. I thank you, Elia. This is, always so fun. I want to invite anyone who wants to ask Elia a question. There's a microphone at the center of the room. Otherwise, we can keep chatting about the dolls and their unruliness. I always imagine them like, when you turn your studio lights out, what they're doing in there.
It's like a Toy Story.
It's more
I
interesting
know.
than a Toy Story.
But those things kind of creep in too,
Totally.
Questions? Yeah, I think you have to go to the mic. Or raise your hand and they'll bring the mic. I don't know. Oh, someone's coming over.
I wanted to start with thanking you for the beautiful interview and the beautiful work.
Thank you.
My question isn't so much for the work because it takes time to absorb, to kind of think of something verbal to ask about the work, but it's more about that role of artist curator. And although I appreciate curators that aren't artists, I just wanted to hear if you had any thoughts about the difference between an artist curator and a curator that's not an artist.
And well, as a curator and working with Susanna and Rodrigo, I was thinking a lot, pretty much how I did the supper club, which was, these conversations were never random. It was strategic on who you brought in together and how that was going to fit to get the conversation that I wanted. And I think that curation kind of works the same, how kind of you can fit those pieces so you have like a nice cohesive story, even if it's like something like a triennial. But as far as like the difference, I can't speak to the people that are not artists and are curators. Like, I don't even know. I think I would probably always want to approach it like a work of art.
And I also want to just add that you have now, beyond the triennial, you've curated, but now you're also teaching. And so I think that's also something relatively new, but it's an extension of your kind of building. I like that you said it's an extension of the supper club. It's like an extension of, not just your practice, but kind of you're a builder of communities.
Yeah, I think even because the class that I'm doing at NYU is more of a seminar, so it is these kind of dialogue with the students, where we read materials and then we kind of like unpack them, which is what I did with the supper club. I would always like pose a question or send something to read or just mention something out in the world and what did you think,
So, thank you for the talk. A lot of the things that you're talking about, to me, I keep thinking Frankenstein. And when I say that, I mean it as like you're creating something where maybe there wasn't something, and where things touch and how they touch seems very important. And maybe even trying to create a reality that you want to happen or for us to look at differently. I just wonder if you could speak about that a little bit.
Well, yeah, it is kind of Frankenstein-ish. When those body shoots were shown for the first time, I think there was a sign out there. Rocio, you remember that? There was a sign, yeah, because there is an element of the grotesque in them. But I think that stems a lot from myself living kind of in this in-between space. And so I'm very much interested in what's happening there in the middle. So as an artist, I love history and I love referencing history, but I'd like to kind of take that and then bring it together and create a new idea, a new
Yeah, like
history.
a new life. I mean it even in the people you bring together, like the different communities, even the way that you curate shows. It feels like you're trying to give life to something. I don't mean it as the monster, I mean it as the life. And so there's an element of the Frankenstein for me that I mean as life-giving, not freakish.
Oh, okay. Well, it's a lot too having to do with it a feeling of invisibility at times as well, because I think, we live in a society that's always like either or, this or that. And, we're actually, humanity lives in gray. And I think we kind of always overlook that. So I'm really interested in those gray areas. And yes, giving life more to those spaces that don't have as much life.
Is there time for one more question? I wanted to ask about the current hand portraits that you're doing, and if you see those as connected in any way to the photo transfers on fabric, or kind of this idea of touch with the soft sculptures.
They are made also through a photo transfer process. It's the same thing, but now I'm like, quote unquote, painting on them too. Even though I don't consider myself a painter, because the way the hands work is that kind of the same thing, the portraits that I did for the Supper Club, where it was a collaboration with the person whose hand that I'm photographing. So, and I don't do random folks. I really feel like I need to have a conversation with you, and it's not like, let's Zoom and let's talk about this and then we're gonna do a hand. It's normally people that I've been interacting with and conversations that we have to kind of build on the portrait through the hands. And then, of course, there is the interconnectivity that you have of all these hands. When you see them all together, then you feel like there's a connection, like what are they trying to say? But then they're also encased. Now I'm encasing them. So it's this also too of like kind of like a preservation, also elevating again these histories, preserving them when they're not really preserved, because it's going back to living in this kind of gray area, but it kind of holding it in.
But I think the gestures are so important that you...
Some of the gestures, like this is some people think it's like gang sign. There is a little bit of element of that. It's not full on gang sign, I'm not gonna do that. But there's something to be said about people doing these signs. It's again, this kind of, it connects to people, whatever it is that they're doing. I'm not justifying that, but the idea of gangs or the idea of people coming together is to find an alleged safe space. And so sometimes the gestures are just the way the hands are. Like Ivan's hands are so beautiful, like even in person. So these are actually really, really big. So they're kind of like reaching to the sky and saying, look at me, So I mean, it depends with each person. A lot of the personality of the sitter is thrown into those portrait hands.
I think that might be a good place to wrap up. So thank you all. It's Elia, always amazing.
Thank you so much.